Hi, everyone. I'm Danielle Wheatley. I'm the editor-in-chief of Women's Health, and welcome tonight to the next in our Work From Home Social Club series. We started these virtual events because, as I said last time, if you're anything like us, you're also keen to see people outside of your four walls that didn't belong to your family and that had interesting things to say and interesting people to do it with. And never more so, if I'm being honest, in a year like this one. Tonight, I am absolutely delighted to welcome the speaker. It's Layla Saad. She is a best-selling author, activist, and speaker. I have just completed her utterly transformative book. It's called Me and White Supremacy. It has topped the lists of bestsellers across the globe, and I'm honored that she had the time and also the emotional bandwidth to stop by and chat with us tonight. Layla writes in her book, it is important to understand that this is deep, raw, challenging, personal, heartbreaking, and heart expanding work. This book will challenge you in ways that you have not been challenged before, but we are living in challenging times and there is much work to be done. And this is why we are here. I'm going to hand over to Layla to introduce herself and to give us the backstory to her writing of this book, which started humbly as an Instagram challenge a few years ago. Layla, thank you so much for joining us from Qatar tonight. I'm thrilled to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Danielle. I'm really excited to be here. And as you know, I'm in the midst of working on the Young Readers edition of my book, but I was really happy that I got a little break to come out and have a conversation with you and our community today. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. I want to ask you a little bit about the background to you first writing this book. I know that it started as an Instagram challenge that became a downloadable PDF that has now ended up this incredibly insightful workbook. But maybe just talk us through how the Instagram challenge started and where that began, and then we'll get stuck into some questions.
Sure. So it feels like it was such a long time ago, but it actually wasn't. It was just over 2 years ago today. I put up a post on my Instagram page inviting people who were white and who had white privilege to go on a 28-day journey with me to unpack and explore and understand and really reckon with what it means to have white privilege and what their complicity, personal complicity in white supremacy was. At that point, I'd been talking about racism and white supremacy for almost a year. The year before that, I had written a letter a sort of blog post called I Need to Talk to Spiritual White Women About White Supremacy, which I wrote on the back of the Unite the Right rally that had happened in Charlottesville, Virginia, that really deeply triggered me. I wanted to say something, and it had been the first time ever that I'd ever publicly spoken about white supremacy or racism. But I just felt deeply moved after seeing those images of those white men who were just full of vitriol, full of hate. And I really felt like, you know, I'm working in the space of personal development and personal growth and wellness and healing, but we never have a conversation about racism. And I really felt like I needed to address that in my own way. And so when I started talking about racism and white supremacy, there was a lot of pushback. It's not like, it's really different now, especially the time that we're in right now in 2020 with the, you know, two things happening at once, the global COVID pandemic and the global Black Lives Matter protests that were sparked by the murder of George Floyd. Now we're in a time where people are hungry for this information and really wanting to have these conversations. Back in 2017, it was an entirely different world. And so at that time, when I first started talking about these topics, I got a lot of pushback, a lot of white fragility, as I talk about in the book, and just a lot of people feeling very defensive and upset by this conversation because they felt like, why are you telling us that we are racist? Why are you telling us that we need to reckon with white supremacy? You need to be talking to those people, the bad people, and not us. And I really felt it was important for people who had white privilege and didn't see themselves as the bad ones to actually look at, actually, how are you complicit in ways that you don't even realize? And so the Me and White Supremacy Instagram challenge that I started almost a year after that was a way for me, because I was noticing, oh, there has been a shift in people being receptive to this message. I wonder what they've learned in this time about themselves and white supremacy. And I really wanted to, instead of me just saying, here's what you need to learn, I wanted them to tell me what they had learned. And I found that to be a really effective method for people who have white privilege to take that personal accountability and to get personally involved in this work. And so I ran over the course of 28 days a free Instagram challenge on my page, where every day I asked different questions about different aspects of white supremacy. I talked about things like white privilege and white fragility, tone policing, anti-Blackness and racist stereotypes, cultural appropriation, white feminism, and so on and so forth. And we did something that was very experimental, it felt like, because people were live journaling their unconscious racist thoughts and beliefs and behaviors. And I was really thankful for all the people who showed up to do the work with integrity. And it was one of the most exhausting experiences of my life. It really required every part of me to show up, to hold the space of integrity, and to not let my own triggers as a Black woman having to listen to white people's racism, and to let my own triggers not derail from the process that I was walking out, that I could tell was a very transformative process. And so as soon as we started, I think by day 1, day 2, I recognized this is not just an Instagram challenge. This is something bigger, because things that people were sharing and the ways that people were showing up and really self-reflecting, I hadn't ever seen it before in that way. And I knew that I had to be carefully curating each day, so that one day led to the next day, led to the next day, and so forth, that we were really going on a journey. Because I could tell it's going to become something else after we finish this challenge. And so when we did finish the challenge, I went away and decided to write it as a PDF workbook, a digital workbook that I published at the end of 2018. And in the same way that the Instagram challenge itself went viral, the workbook also did. Within 3 days, more than 11,000 people had downloaded it. And within 6 months, almost 100,000 people had downloaded it. And so very quickly, I started hearing from publishers who also got wind of it and wanted to know, have you ever thought about publishing this as an actual published book? And because I could see that the work was being taken into spaces and places that I hadn't even thought of: schools, universities, corporations, nonprofits, churches, just all kinds of places where people were printing out this workbook, right? And I realized, no, it has to be more accessible than that. It has to be a book that they can hold, or a book that they can listen to or have on their Kindle or whatever it is. And so that's why I decided to then publish it as a book. And at each stage, from Instagram challenge to digital workbook to traditionally published book, I've expanded and deepened at each level. I think that the major difference between the kind of book that's out in the world now and the PDF workbook was that, I didn't really share anything of myself in the Instagram challenge or the workbook. I didn't share any of my personal stories, my own personal experiences with racism. And I didn't go deep in sharing historical context or examples from the media or statistics and facts that I felt were important to add. And so I really poured all of that into the book, because I wanted people to not just have a sort of process that they could walk through, but that they would also engage in it at a deep personal level and feel personally connected to it, and understand that it's not just it's not just about understanding it intellectually, but it's also about really expanding, your heart. And that's something that I've definitely had feedback that people have felt like, they're learning in different ways from hearing stories and facts and getting historical context, but it's also really connecting on a personal level as well.
It is, I mean, heart expanding is such a great way to describe the book. I think that's what I found so amazing about it when I started working through it myself, was it can be such a sticky and such an academic topic at the same time. People don't want to talk about racism. I think the idea of even confronting a statement like white supremacy, people find very confrontational. And I know you chat about it as you get straight into the book, but maybe just to talk through, like, psychologically why you chose a title like this. Especially when once you get into the challenge itself, it's so incredibly fulfilling in terms of the journaling aspect to it. And I will chat to you a little bit more about that, but let's talk titles first and then get into that.
I think when people first hear the title, they feel something. there's a
Yeah.
there's a feeling that comes up, but that's not the reason why I chose that title. It wasn't just for a clickbait or so that it would create a visceral reaction. The reason why I chose that title is because I felt that it was important for people, everyday people, to understand that we're actually talking about a system of oppression. We're not just talking about was that thing that they said racist, or was it unkind, but it's actually about systems, it's actually about privileges, it's actually about a culture of whiteness being so-called supreme, and that if we make it the norm that we can talk about this system of oppression without fragility, without fear or shyness or discomfort, if we make it the norm that we can say these words, then we have a real chance of being able to fight it and dismantle it and create something better. But if we're not afraid, if we are afraid to call it for what it is, then how are we going to undo it? And so I wanted to use that title, A, like I said, because I think it's important to name things for what they are, but also B, to take the fear out of it, to take the and to take the confusion out of it as well, that white supremacy is just something that those people do, or those people are a part of, and I'm a good person, or I vote a certain way, or have certain spiritual beliefs, or I don't see color, and therefore that isn't anything to do with me. And I know, we can all agree that there are people who consciously, proudly have racist thoughts and beliefs, right? Proudly have white
Yeah.
supremacist beliefs. And that isn't the norm. But to say that white supremacy is only that and not the entire system that we are all conditioned into, the culture that we are all, indoctrinated into, would be to really miss the mark. And so I wanted to bring it to the center instead of keeping it as this fringe thing.
No, and I think that's exactly it. You do, I think, in your own mind, want to think about it as a fringe thing, and to land it so centrally to how you think about what you deal with in terms of the book was incredibly powerful for me just when I started it. I wanted to ask you, I think part of the challenge is that people care about the things that are directly related to them. So, how do we get someone who is not a woman or a person of color or not part of an LGBTQ community to care about these kind of issues? How do you get that conversation going with people? How do you get them to pick up the book, to know even that they need to be doing the work?
Yeah. Well, I think that definitely that responsibility really lands on the people who also have that privilege to have those conversations with those people. So there's a difference, for example, we talk about you and I, there's a difference between me trying to convince a white person that they should do this work versus you sharing your own experiences as someone who has that privilege and explaining why, right? So I think it's very important to understand that if you are in the position of privilege, that you have to take on that responsibility, that it's my job to have those conversations with people who also have that privilege and take the burden off of people who don't have that privilege. That is really huge. And also, I think this idea that we don't care is this, it comes back to this false belief that we're not all interconnected. We are all interconnected. Your life affects mine, my life affects yours. And if we cannot see that something that we think is just a Black issue or a people of
Mhm.
color issue or a disabled issue, that doesn't impact me, we're not seeing the ways that me having privilege also takes away my humanity, because it means I'm also okay with living in a world where I'm benefited at the expense of other people who don't have those same privileges. I know that, we are living in a world that's both like hyper connected and disconnected at the same time. We're hyper, like, I'm in Qatar, you're in South Africa, like there's people from all around the world
Yeah.
listening, right? So we're super connected in that way, but also we're not at the same time. We're disconnected from ourselves a lot of the time and disconnected from our communities. And so this is kind of a bigger question or a bigger care around how do we recreate community in a very over-connected world where we feel like we're connected, but actually we're scared to be vulnerable with each other, real
Mhm.
vulnerability, right? We cancel each other at the drop of a hat, right? We don't give each other the space to make mistakes or ourselves to make mistakes. We don't know how to apologize if we make a mistake or get something wrong. It's really that bigger question, because what I want at least, is in the coming of the dismantling of white supremacy, that we are not just focused on the end of the world that we don't want, but really focus on what is it that we're trying to build. And that all of us have to get there together. All of us have to get there together, and all of us have to get to that new world whole. Right?
I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing to listen to you speak, because it frames it all with such a positive, forward moving momentum. And I absolutely love that. And I think it's so much what I took out of the book as well, is that I feel like you opened your heart and made yourself emotionally vulnerable in that way to allow us to do the work. I mean, you really did, you put something out there that means that we get to go on this journey with you. And I found that so incredible. And I want to ask you, you spoke, I mean, you just spoke briefly about it now, but about the burden of responsibility, as white people, to talk to others about dismantling that system, and kind of, and really looking and recognizing that privilege and looking at how that changes their world. You also speak in the book about being a good ancestor as a black woman and as a person of color. And I think that's it's a really interesting point for me in terms of the South African context, because we have such a diverse market and we have such a diverse audience tonight. And I really want to talk about the idea and the concept behind being a good ancestor on the flip side of the coin.
Yeah, I think something that we are, again, like we're so aware of it, but we don't want to be aware of it, which is that our life is finite and we will actually die one day. And so we will all be ancestors one day. Right, the ancestor doesn't have to be kind of like the great literary ancestors I have behind me, the Toni Morrisons and the Audre Lordes. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to be this internationally known person, but all of us will die and will become ancestors. And so I really think about in my own life, what is the legacy that I want to leave behind? Not as someone who's known as a best-selling author or a teacher, but just me, my humanity. What do I want my humanity to have meant while I was here? The people who come into contact with me, my children, my family, my friends, anyone who may read what I do, the conversations that I get to have with other people. What fingerprint do I want to leave behind? What is the legacy? What do I want people to remember? And how do I want it to touch them and transform them? And so whether you have a platform or not, right? Whether you are in a position of leadership or authority or not, it doesn't really matter. You will impact people. Your life is impacting people, and it will impact people after you're gone. And so you have a choice on what that impact could be. If we think about, especially when we're talking about those people who've had white privilege in the past as ancestors who have passed, if they had perhaps made different choices about the legacy that they had left behind for us, might we have a different world? And I mean, Absolutely, right? And so each one of
Right.
us today, regardless of whatever race we are, um, also should be reckoning with that question for ourselves. What world might come after I'm gone because of the choices I made and how I live my life while I was here? And I think the question for white people as well is there's kind of an extra layer to it, which is, you know, we are as white people, we have inherited what it means to be white and everything that comes with that, right? And we can either feel guilt and shame and sadness and frustration for it, and I think those emotions are I think they are what's the word, appropriate. I think they're appropriate emotions to feel, um, and we have to do something with that, right? And so, as somebody who will be a white ancestor, what is the legacy of whiteness that I will leave behind? Do I want to continue in the path of the legacy of whiteness globally being colonization and harm and, superiority and supremacy? Or could I be a white ancestor who has taken the time and the energy and the resources to really reckon with what it means to have white privilege? Have I taken the time and the energy and resources to be able to show up in allyship and accompliship to Black, Indigenous people of color? Have I taught my children something different than I was taught myself so that I can better equip them to be able to have racial conversations and to be able to reckon with racist systems, right? All of that is important. Like, our lives don't just belong to us. I know it can feel that way, right? And we can feel really selfish, and I've just got to get mine in this lifetime. But our lives don't just belong to us, they belong to everyone who comes into contact with us, whether we ever meet them or not. Like, I have these great ancestors behind me, Maya Angelou, Octavia Butler, Toni Morrison, and Audre Lorde, because each one of them, their writings and their being impacts me. I've never had the privilege of meeting them, but in reading their books, in listening to their interviews, in hearing about some of the things that they did, I'm so deeply touched. And so their lives didn't just belong to them; their lives belong to me also, and everyone who gets the benefit to read their works and to hear them speak. And I think it's important for us to really understand that your life matters, your life will have an impact, and you have to take on the personal responsibility of choosing and influencing what that
Mm.
impact might be.
It's such a powerful message. And I know that, I mean, you briefly mentioned it at the beginning of the conversation tonight, that you've started working on a book that deals with this for children and for teens. And I'd love to know your thoughts on that. I mean, it does tap into the idea of being a good ancestor. How do we address these kind of topics with our children? How do you delve into this subject? Do you treat it head on like we do in this book? uh, should it be approached in a different way? What are your thinkings around that, and what are you putting into this next book as a seed?
Yeah, so I'm very what's the word? Like, very, like, holding it close to my heart right now, because I'm still very much in that formation process and the creative process. But I definitely do have thoughts around parenting and white supremacy. In fact, I have a course on my website called Parenting and White Supremacy, where I
Okay.
talk to white parents, or parents who have white privilege, who are parents of kids who have white privilege. How do you
Yeah.
talk to your kids about racism? My mother, as a Black mother of Black children, didn't have any other choice but to speak to me directly about racism. Myself, as a Black mother with Black children, I have no choice but to speak to them directly about it, because I must prepare them for
Mm.
a world in which they could experience racism, at 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old, right? So I can't leave it to chance.
Yeah.
And I can't leave them unprepared and hope that when it does occur, that they'll have the tools and the words to be able to deal with it. The thing about having white privilege is you don't have to have a conversation about racism or what it means to be white, because that isn't something where your kids are, negatively impacted. But in order to create an anti-racist world, it's so important for white parents, parents who have white privilege, to be talking to their kids about this from a very young age. Kids begin to notice difference very early. In the same way that they'll notice that you know, she has blonde hair and she has black hair, or she's wearing glasses, or they notice that this is that color and this is this color. They don't necessarily ascribe meaning to it in the same way they don't ascribe meaning to having blue eyes or brown eyes until society starts feeding messages about what race means. And those messages start really early. They are in, you know, TV shows, magazines, textbooks at school, you know, the choice of books, of what kind of books the schools are telling kids to read. And of course, messaging at home as well. And very well-meaning white parents who they themselves did not have parents who knew how to have those conversations when they were kids, are passing on those same lessons, which are just not sufficient. It's not sufficient to teach your children to be colorblind, or to say we don't see color. It's not sufficient to say, don't say black, or don't say she's that color, right? It's not sufficient to just say, oh, we just believe there's just one race, the human race, or a racist is just a bad person, you know. It's not sufficient to give your kids those messages, because then they think that they are that, you know. In the book I talk about white exceptionalism. Oh, it's not me, I'm one of the good ones because I don't see color and I just try and treat everyone the same. They don't see the everyday racism, the tone policing and the white superiority and the white centering. And so it's very important to have those conversations early and consistently, not as a one-time talk, right? It's not the one-time like birds and the bees talk, right? It's an ongoing conversation, because what you want to be able to do is to help them develop the language to be able to talk about race and racism in a nuanced way. You want to help them to understand what it means to have privilege or not have privilege and how that plays out. You want to give them the resiliency so they don't develop into adults who easily slip into white fragility anytime a racial conversation comes up, right? You want them to feel confident to use their voice when they see racism happening, to challenge, you know, racist policies or a racist situation. And you want them to be able to have conversations with their friends who are also kids of color in a way where they know that it's okay to ask questions, but it's also okay to receive feedback that that wasn't an okay question to ask, right? And not get defensive when someone gives you feedback that you did something that you didn't mean, you know, in a bad way, but actually did come across in a bad way, right? That they're able to learn and make mistakes. And so the same things that, you know, anti-racism educators such as myself are trying to teach white adults is, if we can give those skills to kids from a really young age, they don't turn into adults where they're having to learn things that they should have learned when they were kids.
Completely. I mean, that makes so much sense, that journey, just to start it earlier and earlier, to give them the toolbox to actually talk about things and address those. I want to get back to the idea of white supremacy and whether you think it's a monolithic concept. I mean, is it the same in the UK and the US and South Africa, or should we tailor some of the book's recommendations for different spaces, or even possibly like for different environments, like how we deal with things within a friendship or a family group or a workspace?
Yeah, I think the kind of aspects of white supremacy that I talk about in the book, I think, you know, the book is available in many different countries, and many people from many different backgrounds have resonated with, oh, I do that, or I see how in our country that's a real thing. But at the same time, white supremacy shows up differently in different countries because of each country's unique history. So for example, the unique history of South Africa means that white supremacy has shown up in a certain way there. It has impacted and harmed Black people and people of color in very specific ways there. There are very specific conversations that need to be held in South Africa that will be different from the UK or the United States, for example. And there are cultural patterns that develop that are very specific to that region. So for example, many countries would say, in the UK and Canada, for example, and many European countries are very guilty of this, of saying, oh, we're not racist, it's the US, that's where the real racism is, right? And not realizing the ways and the sneaky ways that racism shows up in their culture. So for example, I say in the UK, first of all, the way British people communicate and the way American people communicate is very different. And racism in the UK, what I've noticed is it shows up in a very polite, passive-aggressive way. It doesn't mean that it's any less harmful. It's just expressed differently. And so I think it is important to understand that white supremacy is happening within the context of each country's culture, its history, its way of expressing and communicating. But at the same time, tone policing around the world often looks the same. White fragility often looks the same. And so both and at the same time. And then you ask the question around, is it different when we're talking to our friends or our family members or our colleagues, right? And yeah, absolutely, it's different because there's different dynamics. In the workplace, you already have hierarchy, right? There's this position, that position, that position, and things are kept that way so that companies can keep running, but also it can prevent real conversations that need to be had. And so the way that you may need to talk about, or that you may be allowed to talk about white supremacy in the workplace, is going to be very different to how you may be able to have a conversation with your friends. Will be very different to, depending on your family dynamic. In your family, do you have open and real discussions, or is everything swept under the carpet, right? So it will be different depending on the kind of context and the situation. I think the thing to remember, though, is not to use the fact that those dynamics exist as an excuse not to say anything, as an excuse to retreat into white silence because of those dynamics. I think that's the key thing to take away.
I think that's so important. You speak about white silence in your book, and it resonated with me such a lot, because I think it often is I think particularly as white people, sometimes if you're in those situations of you keep quiet, because there's as much of an uncomfortableness about addressing racist behaviors and calling it out. And I want to ask you, like, how do you think we can each use our voices to dismantle those kind of systems in like a workplace or in a family? Like, how do you enter into those conversations? Is it just, do you just call it out? Do you?
I think oftentimes the kind of reasoning for staying in white silence is, first of all, what is the impact going to be on me? Like, what are they going to think about me? And how safe is it going to be for me to continue to be in this environment? And one of the things that I really need people who have white privilege to understand is that part of, quote unquote, using your privilege, which isn't a term that I really like because it almost feels very like white saviorist. But if we're, I think people can understand what I mean in that sense of using your privilege. Part of that is being willing to put yourself in situations where you are at risk. It isn't safe. People may not like you. People may say that you're difficult, or that you're rocking the boat, or whatever it is that they say. Because for me, as a Black person, when I try and bring it up, even if I use the sweetest, softest, nicest, most eloquent words, I'm still going to be perceived 9 times out of 10 as an angry Black woman who's got a chip on her shoulder and is just pulling the race card, right? And so, and I will get the the pushback and the whatever form of fragility and attack comes with that. And so part of, using your privilege, or as I say in the book, losing your privilege, is being willing to say, well, that's a burden that I have to take on, that I have to speak up. It is on me to speak up. And when you speak up, you're not just calling out what others are doing, but also including yourself in that as well, right? We need to take accountability. Because one of the things that I think people who have white privilege can slip into once they get some of the languaging and some of the understanding about anti-racism is to start to separate themselves from other white people, because now they have a bit of consciousness around this. They have a bit of learning around this, and they can see it playing out with other white people. And so they start preaching at other white people and saying, I can't believe you would do that. And that is so racist, and all of that. And that, absolutely, sometimes things need to be called out, and things need to be brought to the surface and talked about. But you have to include yourself in there, because you also still have white privilege. And so that white silence, that I think that the nuance, well, part of the nuance of understanding the speaking up is also speaking up about your own complicity as well, and saying, we need to fix this. We are causing harm. We have this privilege. We are making it difficult for other people. We need to do something about that. But absolutely, yeah, you need to call it out directly, right? I remember I was at a book event, and somebody sat down with me, and they worked at a school, and they said, I work at this school and we don't really have many diverse books, and I, want to bring up this issue that we need more diverse books, but I know that many of the white parents in the school, feel very uncomfortable with this situation, with this conversation, and that they will be upset by it. And I think the school might be upset by it. And so what should I do? And I said, well, it sounds like you're asking me, how do you call out racism and still make sure that everybody likes you, and still make sure that you get to do it in a way that you're safe? And I said, I'm really sorry to burst your bubble, but there's no way to do that.
It's not how it happens.
So either you can be liked, right, and stay safe and stay comfortable and not rock the boat, or you can say what needs to be said and ask for the change that needs to be done, and expect that you're going to get this pushback and this feedback, and people are not going to like it. And you have to be so committed to making sure that change happens that even when that comes, you keep going.
It's the being a good ancestor, right?
That's right.
It's about keeping, that is what you want to keep in mind through those conversations. So
because everyone's waiting for somebody else. Everyone's waiting for somebody else to do it. Everybody's waiting for somebody else to speak up. And it's like, who are you waiting for? It's you. You noticed that something was wrong. It's on you to say something.
That was absolutely something that I found in your book. So for those of you who haven't read Layla's book, and I urge you to read it if you haven't after this conversation, each chapter that she gets into, there's a journaling exercise at the end of each chapter that asks you questions about your own experiences. And I found that so incredibly powerful and so personal, because it makes you think in your own context about things. So rather than just reading it and kind of nodding along, which I was doing even in the first chapter, I was like, oh, yes, I have felt that, I see that, I've definitely. And then I got to the end, I had to actually answer, really think about the answers to the questions that you asked. And it makes it so personal and so incredibly, powerful is really the only word to use, because it really kind of lands it for you in such a visceral way that you get to think about your own experience in all of those things, including for me, the uncomfortableness around calling those sort of things out, to think you don't feel it in yourself, but sometimes you don't say it out loud. You're just complicit in those kind of conversations otherwise, which I found, it was amazing to kind of work through the book in that way. And I think often the uncomfortableness for me in a situation like that is that there is still such defensiveness to being called out on something like that, that it almost makes you want to avoid it. And your conversation around being a good ancestor almost it reminded me of that thing, because it's like it doesn't matter if the response is going to be defensive. That's precisely why you say it. Like, you're doing it
Yeah,
for the
yeah.
fact that you get to call it out, and exactly, be a good ancestor, take on the uncomfortableness and the defensiveness that comes with it. Those conversations around diversity, it was incredibly powerful, and I loved the journaling aspect. I'm not sure how an Instagram challenge became the journaling, and I'm not sure how it even begins to kind of turn into a 28-day challenge. I want to wrap tonight up because we're not going to take questions, but I want to ask you, before we end, what has changed for you? You spoke briefly about it starting in 2017 to now, and there's obviously this year particularly, there's been a lot boiling. But what has changed from your point of view and for you in starting that original Instagram challenge, and where things began then, for you to look back on these last couple of years, and how much has happened in your own life with the book, and now looking towards writing a book that is for younger children and for teens dealing with the same thing. When you look back on the last couple of years, tell us how that's been.
Well, I think none of us can deny that this year is one for the books, right?
Right.
For so many reasons, for so many different reasons, but particularly around this conversation of anti-racism, Black Lives Matter, doing the work. It has gone, quote unquote, mainstream in a way that I just have never seen before. And it gives me chills thinking about it. And at the same time, I feel like I'm constantly sort of cautiously walking this knife edge between, wow, this is incredible, so much change is happening, that a book like mine and so many books that are currently on the bestsellers list, directly talk about white supremacy, directly talk about racism, are written by, Black people and people of color. Like, that is incredible. And the other edge of that knife edge is this going to be just another phase? Is this just going to be another trend? Is this just the it thing now? And then we go back to how things were. And I was recently interviewed by Refinery 2029, and I said, the fear is that a few weeks from now, things go back to how they were before, except now it's more dangerous because people feel like they did the work. There was this
Yeah.
feverish rush to buy the books and to follow the people and to read the articles, right? To have the conversation. And because people they were approaching it with this great sense of urgency, that they were trying to consume everything all at once. And now they're burnt out. And they slip back into what I call, what I talk about in the book, white apathy. Because you approach something that is a lifelong marathon with the energy of a 2-month sprint, right?
Horrifying, but true, right?
Right. And there are going to be many people who fall into that category, because the truth of the matter is, the reason why white supremacy continues to exist and thrive in the world today in the way that it does is because privilege feels so good, right? Privilege is safe and it's comfortable and it gives you these rewards, and you don't have to think about all of these hard things. And I often think about, like, the movie The Matrix, right? And popping the pill and like leaving behind the comfort and seeing this is what you are actually in. But even though there's that character who's like, I know the food isn't real, but I'd rather eat this this fake food than eat that disgusting porridge that's in the real world, right? And the
The
truth
Neo.
about right, and the truth about anti-racism work is that there isn't this like arc of, you go through this journey and go through all these hardships and learn all these lessons, and then you get to this safe space at the other end where everything feels good again.
Mm.
We're nowhere near that. We have been reckoning with racism and white supremacy for centuries, for multi-generations into the past, which means this work must continue for multi-generations into the future. Which means that in signing up for this work, you're signing up for, good ancestor work, multi-generational. And so, you have to really ask yourself, like, am I in it for the real deal? Or as soon as
Mm.
it gets uncomfortable, or I get called out, or I have to really think about maybe losing certain friendships, or giving up certain, people who I followed, or products that I bought, or changing my career, or, giving money over, like once it gets there and I think, oh, that's too much now.
Yeah.
Right? And I'd rather actually go back to how things were. But you kind of feel like, but I did that work for a while, so I'm okay.
Yeah. I did.
It's okay.
I parked
Right.
it
And so
there.
I parked it there. I ticked my boxes.
Yeah.
And I can even have the conversation in a nuanced way because I learned all the words, right? And that's one of my fears. So I feel like I'm walking this knife edge, which I
Mm.
think many people who are Black and people of color also feel as well. A question that I often get from white interviewers actually is, do you have hope now? Like, do you feel hopeful about the future? And I think that's a question that I think white people should be reckoning with for themselves is, am I giving Black people a reason to be hopeful by my actions? Am I giving them a reason to be hopeful? Because for me to have hope collectively in white people, when collectively white people only showed up what a month and a half ago, right?
Yeah.
Would be very naive of me for me to suddenly say, oh, okay, they're here, they've arrived, they're gonna,
Yes.
right? It would be
I
very
cracked open
naive
my
of me,
heart. I gave them
right?
a workbook and
Right.
now they are here.
They're
Yeah.
here. No,
Yeah.
as white people collectively, and and that collectively has to start obviously personally and individually. As white people and people who have white privilege, you have to give us reasons to be hopeful. And that has to come with evidence of changed behavior, changed systems, showing up for us, having those conversations, doing the work, teaching your children differently. And we can only measure that in the results. We can't measure it now in 2020. We can look back maybe in 2030 and see what happened in the last 10 years that was different. How did life change? Did Black, Indigenous people of color feel like they could breathe more easily? Did they feel safer? Was there more equity? Was there more justice? It
Mm.
comes out in the results. And so we're still in it. We're in the thick of it. And every day counts and every action counts. But I really want white people to give us reasons to be hopeful. And I know that sounds very cynical, but I don't think it is. I think it's important to
No,
be,
I don't think it is.
I think it's important to be realistic, especially when we consider how many ancestors died for these movements. And they didn't, they were killed. They didn't willingly give up their lives, right? They were killed because of these movements. And when we realistically think about every single day, how many Black people are killed because of these issues, and even if they're not killed, that they are suffering from, higher blood pressure and, all kinds of, physical issues and like the well-being, our mental well-being, that we can't relax because we don't know when we wake up today, are we going to face racism today? So we have to be realistic because that's how we survive and that's how we keep going. But for those who have white privilege, it's really taking on that responsibility of, I have to give them a reason to be hopeful by my actions.
I think that is a very, very solid place to end on that message. Layla, I don't think I could have loved you any more after going through your book, but after tonight, I'm afraid to say it's got a little bit creepier. And I'm now definitely worse off than I was before. I'm so incredibly appreciative of the book because I think that what you put into it for all of us is something quite extraordinary. And I'm so appreciative of you taking the time tonight to be live from Qatar and to be so engaged with me, with the audience tonight. I'm just incredibly grateful. For those of you online, there is a loot link that is in the chat box that links directly to Layla's book if you want to find it online and pick it up right now. But otherwise, you will find it online wherever you normally shop. Layla, thank you once again. I absolutely loved this last hour chatting to you, and I really am so grateful. It's so much food for thought, and I really thank you from the bottom of my heart. We were delighted to have you with us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was really my pleasure. I really loved it. Thank you.
Thank you.